this is so interesting because in a lot of ways, the conversation we in the U.S. are having now about China is the conversation India was having back in 1950.
Yeah, true. I mean, it's great that you bring that up because one of the important things about this particular war is that when we're talking about the 1962 war and why India went wrong in assessing Chinese intentions, one of the key things that we need to remember here is that the Indian military planners, that is, I mean, even when I say military planners, they are the politicians, that is, the defense minister and the prime minister of the day. They looked at the world in binaries. That is, if there was something that happened with China, it would either be a localized affair on the borders, or it would turn out into something that is as catastrophic as World War III, right? And this was eerily similar to what the CIA was doing in 1950, while they were making assessments about the Chinese intentions in the Korean War, right? When the question was, would China, fight on the behalf of the North Koreans? Would they be part of the war, the Korean War? The CIA kept on saying that, look, there's no way that the Chinese are going to fight unless they would want to risk seeing a World War III, right? So what both India and the United States got terribly wrong about the Chinese is their worldview. And this is an important thing for us to remember, because today when we are focusing on China, we should not once again commit the mistake of what in intelligence analysis we call as mirror imaging, right? So mirror imaging is where I mean, it's clear that, I mean, most of your listeners would know what the term means. That is to look at the other party and hope and believe that they would behave the same way you would behave in a given set of circumstances. Now, when you look at the 1962 war, and when you try to identify if mirror imaging actually played a role, it's really funny and interesting as well, because you'll see both Indians and the Chinese were mirror imaging each other, right? So what the Indians did was, just to take you back to the conditions that prevailed around that time before 1962, the Chinese economy was doing really badly because of the Cultural Revolution and so on. Millions of people had died, and so the economy was in doldrum. And similarly, India was also facing certain economic hardships. Now, what the Indians thought was the Chinese would not afford a war because their economy is weak, whereas the Chinese felt that the Indians are going to, are getting increasingly aggressive because they would want to divert public attention from domestic weaknesses, right? Now, what the Chinese were doing was they were trying to assess Indians from a point of view of what they would have done if they were in the position of economic weakness, which they were. And what the Indians were doing was trying to assess what the Chinese would have done in the event of economic weakness. And essentially, what the Chinese ended up doing is to wage a war in order to divert public attention from the economic distresses. And that is what we saw even a few years before the war, that is in 1958, when the 57-58, when the Taiwan Strait crisis happened. The Chinese leadership of the day, Mao Zedong, was very good at using this tactic, right? That is to create external enemies and then divert attention from whatever internal problems were there, right? So it's kind of an odd scenario where you fail to understand your enemy, you fail to understand the other party simply because you're projecting your own viewpoints on them. And that is the mistake that even the United States did all through these years, when the United States believed that by virtue of bringing in economic reforms, by virtue of making China rich, that a certain kind of democracy will creep into China. There will be a certain kind of reform that will come up in China. But that was bunkum. It was proved that it's not going to happen, right? And for this reason, maybe I'll stop for you to ask a question, but it's for this reason we say that we need to understand the Chinese strategic culture, the Chinese way of thinking for what it is. And that's where the 1962 war becomes a key moment, where everything that the Indians believed turned out to be wrong, simply because the Chinese way of thinking, the Chinese way of policy making did not fit our way of thinking about them.
Now that's interesting. So you're saying that way of thinking is different because while India was looking at it like, hey, we're both post-colonial powers, there's something fundamental about this communist Marxist-Leninist ideology that China had that made it incompatible with a peaceful coexistence with India.
Yeah, it is not just the communist Leninist ideology, right? I mean, if let's for example just take the example of the Soviet Union and communist China. Now both were communist, but look at what happened after the death of Stalin. You had Nikita Khrushchev come to power, and reveal it to the entire communist fraternity of nations about the excesses, horrors committed by Stalin, right? The gulags and so on, right? But to this day, you rarely come across any senior CCP leader talk about the excesses committed by Mao, right? They, that should tell you that although these two countries follow the ideology of communism, their behavior is not necessarily driven solely by solely by the theories of these ideologies, right? And that's exactly what happened in 1962. In 1950, once the Chinese PLA took over Tibet, once they entered Tibet, the Indian Intelligence Bureau of that time, they made a right prediction that China is going to get expansionist. And why did they do it? They did it because they were, if you went back and studied the Intelligence Bureau of that time, they were all experts. The senior most hierarchy were all experts of international communism, right? So they could see that China is going to get expansionist and they are going to move forward. But what they could not exactly say is what kind of expansionism would take place, right? How would they go about doing things? So that's where we need to sort of bring out a balance between the whole ideology of communism, international communism, and the historic culture, historic knowledge that the Chinese tend to follow, right? So when you see when you if you ever got a chance to read some of the works written by some scholars who study strategic culture, when they look at China, they trace Mao's policies and the strategies guiding Mao's policies, especially when it comes to warfare and so on, to the Ming Dynasty, right? So what exactly are they looking at? They're looking at fundamental things. For example, the nature of conflict. You know, if you talk about the nature of conflict, how does China view conflict, right? And for the Chinese, conflict is nothing but an expression of contradictions, and they believe that these contradictions are constant. So what they do is they look at two different levels. You know, there are primary contradictions and secondary contradictions, and they believe that even as you are settling down these primary contradictions, the secondary ones come up. So which means that no two nations can ever be friends. There will always be differences, right? So that is the primary worldview, that you can never be friends. That's point number one. But from there flows the next question. Okay, if there are going to be contradictions, then how are you going to settle this, right? So then what is the nature of this enemy that you're talking about? So that's where the Chinese believe that your enemies can never be transformed, right? So you have to go in for decimation. So when you even study Sun Tzu's Art of War and so on, they talk about a bloodless war and all that, right? But at the core of it is war, right? They're also when you look at Mao's strategy, the protracted war and so on, they're looking for annihilation of the enemy, right? But it's only a question of when and how to do it. And that's where their idea of violence becomes fundamentally different from our ideas of violence. And that feeds into why this whole idea of the Third World War coming up, which the CIA or the Indian Intelligence Bureau thought at that point in time, or the Indian Prime Minister thought at that point in time, was basically useless. Because what the Chinese strategic culture or Mao's thinking says is that unlike the Western world looks at policy making in different stages, right? You have diplomacy, you have all sorts of coercion or conciliations and all that, which under which you see the use of force or violence as the instrument of last resort, right? You've tried everything possible, and when nothing worked, then you believe that getting into war is the only option left for you now. Whereas the Chinese don't see violence as the instrument of last resort. They don't see the use of force as the instrument of last resort. They believe that violence is absolutely necessary, right? But what is most important here is you need to have absolute tactical and operational intelligence on the enemy to know if by using violence now, if you can totally decimate your enemy or not, right? And that in 1962, when you look at the 1962 India-China war, that kind of operational and tactical intelligence, they had the best advantage possible, to the extent that when the war ended, the kind of humiliation that India suffered was actually a surprise to the Chinese as well, because even they did not expect India to be humiliated so badly, right? When you look at the war, when you talk about the 1962 war, it's actually in two parts. One was the Chinese betrayal and the surprise, but the other part was India's own military incompetence, right? Because of faulty assumptions and faulty operational conduct and so on. But that's the whole point, because the Chinese have a clear understanding of what the nature of conflict. When I say clear understanding, it is their subjective understanding. But because their execution of policies are tempered by such understandings. The tendency for China's enemy to surprise to be surprised is much higher than for Beijing to be surprised. Now, let me just draw your attention just for one small point. So, even as I'm saying this, the reason why I brought up this point is, if you look at the recent clashes that have happened on the India-China borders, there once the Chinese made their ingressions in the Galwan region, and the Indians took another set of territory by surprise called the Kailash Ranges. That really surprised the Chinese, because you see they had understood all these three factors, but where they were surprised was that they did not expect India to fight back, right? So that's the key point here, right? So it's about understanding the Chinese, but through that understanding, knowing what kind of responses you need to craft yourself. And there, the Chinese understand nothing but the language of brute force and showing that you are capable of defending against them.